I retired 10 years ago, I gave thanks to God that I would never have to preach on this gospel again. I don't get it. We wonder what Matthew had in mind when he put together all these little sayings that make not so much sense to us. They don't seem to match the Jesus that we have come to know. Not necessarily gentle Jesus, meek and mild, but the peacemaker, the lover, the comforter, the one who makes things clear and a pathway to God. So I think about these odd sayings, and I realize that maybe there are a few reasons why they're in there, right smack in the middle of Matthew's gospel. They come after a bunch of parables and healing miracle stories, and they come before more miracles and healing stories, and of course the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. So right in the middle, perhaps Matthew was thinking, I've heard these sayings over the last years, and maybe because I'm not so clear with them, I'll put them here, and in the future, somebody else will maybe make sense of them. We know that these sayings and the rest of Matthew weren't even written down until 90 AD, or CE, as we now say. So that was 3 or 4 generations past the time when Jesus was even alive. So nobody at the time that Matthew was written had heard the actual voice of Jesus speaking these words. There were no videotapes. There was no tape recorders. There was no way that anybody wrote that stuff down. And so over generations, things get a little bit confusing. The danger in thinking that, though, is that all the good stuff also might be getting confusing, too. So it's pretty much of a big mishmash. I do have to say that one thing I have discovered in that reading is that it is about the world we live in. It's not just Jesus' world, where the empire of Rome has really created some dysfunction and violence, created oppression, and the use of power for the rich. That era and that time when Jesus lived was filled with pain and suffering. Oddly enough, the story that Francis read at the beginning, the story of Hagar, also takes place in a time of pain and suffering for a whole group of people. Hagar's story sort of lives that out for us. How many of you have ever heard the story of Hagar, the Egyptian, before? Sounds familiar-ish? Well, for the rest of you, let me just really quickly tell you. Hagar was the maid, the servant of Abraham's wife, Sarah. And this was in like 1700 years before Jesus. So 1700 BCE. And Abraham and Sarah had been promised a child. This didn't seem to be happening. So they had acquired a slave in Egypt on their travels down there, whose name was Hagar. And she was the servant of Sarah, sort of a personal maid. And because God had promised Abraham and Sarah a child, and it wasn't happening, Abraham and Sarah had a great idea, which was to have Hagar stand in for Sarah, have sex with Abraham, and the child that would result would be legally Sarah's child, even though Hagar is the one who gave birth to him. So this happened. And the child's name was Ishmael, which means God has heard me. God hears. So during this time, Sarah has become jealous. And she has resented greatly the fact that her maid is pregnant, has this baby, and she kicks Hagar out of the camp into the wilderness, where surely she will die. All this is fine with Abraham, by the way. He just does what he thinks he needs to do. Anyway, God hears Hagar, saves her life, and she comes back to the camp, has the baby. The baby grows, maybe as an early teenager, 13-ish. And Sarah then miraculously has a son with Abraham, even though she's 90-some years old. And that son is named Isaac. Familiar name to most of you, probably. So we have these two little boys in the same camp with a power differential between the mothers, Sarah, the legal wife of Abraham, and Hagar, the servant. They both have these sons, Isaac and Ishmael, and inevitably jealousy arises, resentment, bad feelings, and what happens is that again, as Francis read, Hagar and Ishmael get kicked out of the camp and are banished to the wilderness. And again, God hears the cries of Ishmael and Hagar, provides them with sustenance, and then suggests that they go through the wilderness to another area called Paran. And there God tells Hagar, you know, Ishmael is also a son of Abraham, so my promise stands, and Ishmael will indeed produce 12 sons, and those people, the descendants, are the Arab people. Meanwhile, Isaac has Jacob and Esau, and Jacob has 12 sons, hence the Jewish people. So conflict, inevitable, family dysfunction, toxic relationships, violence, abandonment. All these things are very familiar to Hagar and Ishmael, were certainly familiar to Jesus and Matthew in Matthew's time of the forming church. So these qualities certainly are familiar to us because we live as human beings, flawed as we are, in a world where people are not perfect. And we have our jealousies and our resentments and our self-righteousness and our unwillingness to bend and our opinions. And in the midst of that, we are to be disciples of Jesus. How do we do that? Well, we struggle with it our whole lives. And that's why I come to church. Maybe it's why you do too. We're trying to learn how to do that. How do we live with one another? How do we reflect the love that Jesus calls us to for our neighbor, for people who are different? How do we make sense of the swords in the world that are not lifted in peace? How do we make sense of family dysfunction and so forth and so on? Interestingly, this morning, I was reading one of my daily emails from a theologian called Richard Rohr, and I thought, well, I could read this to you this morning, and maybe it would help us try to make sense of who we are to be as disciples walking in the way of love. So this is a quote by an Episcopal bishop who he's retired from being the Bishop of Alaska. His name is Stephen Charleston. And he's a very active theologian and wonderful writer and so forth. And so he says, love is the physical structure of the universe. Love is the physical structure of the universe. The universe and each of us are made in the image of God, who is love, a dynamic cycling of infinite pouring and infinite receiving. This is the Trinity that we recognize. If we are to have foundational hope, and a foundational belief in a world that is still and always unfolding towards something better. This is the virtue of hope. I have found that it's almost impossible for individuals or communities to heal over the long haul if they do not trust that the whole cosmic arc is also on a trajectory toward the good. Martin Luther King Jr. said much the same thing. Admittedly, sometimes the sufferings and injustices of our time make it hard to believe in that arc of love. I think that is part of the church's major failure, to provide Western civilization with a positive, hopeful, and cosmic understanding of our own good news. It is a struggle in the midst of all our flaws and all the ways that we are unfaithful. But you and I have decided, through our baptism, to follow Jesus. Not to make it simplified, because it is a complex job for us, but it is simple. We've decided to follow Jesus. So all that he told us, notwithstanding Matthew 10, whatever the verses are, you and I are responsible for being God in the world. So we do that with hope, and we do that as we walk the way of love. Amen.